Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Teresa Amabile. I will tell you all about Professor Amabile in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment. When we exert for one another. And when you do it from a leadership position, as you will discover that Professor Amabile knows much about, you do it to bring people together for a common cause. Professor Teresa Amabile, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
I'm delighted to be here, John. Thank you.
Great. I want to tell folks all about you. You know that I have, because I've told you, I've been following your career, reading your work for decades now, although you're still a young woman, but so we won't say decades, a long time. You are the Edsel Bryant Ford Professor of Business Administration, Emerita at Harvard Business School. Your most recent book, and why we're talking today, is Retiring, Creating a Life That Works for You. It presents insights from decades of research and the psychological, social, and life restructuring, and the challenges you have with retirement. So, and thank you for holding that book up. But you've written many other books, and you have a forthcoming book coming up soon, I think, A Progress Principle, which comes out later. And you, as a professor, you've written over 100 scholarly articles. Many appeared in the Harvard Business Review, where I know your work. You've given TEDx talks. You've worked for little companies like Pixar, Genentech, Pfizer, Apple, and you've spoken at Davos, which is way cool. So, Professor Teresa Amabile, welcome to Grace Under Pressure. So, as I told you, hold up the book again. You wrote Retiring, Creating a Life That Works for You. I think you wrote it especially for me. So what led you to write this, Teresa? So
there were two factors, John. The other book that you mentioned, The Progress Principle, actually came out a few years ago. It's not in press right now. It came out a few years ago. And in that book, one of the main discoveries was that people do their best work. They're most motivated in their work. They have the most positive emotions and impressions of their company and their work team on those days when they're making progress in meaningful work. So that was an important discovery. It has many implications for leadership. And John, may I grab that book off my shelf and just show it to the people who are joining us?
Why not? Please do.
Okay, I will grab it now.
And I'll keep talking. So I love this topic. Many of my listeners know that, as you know, because I told you, I myself am semi-retired. So that's why I said this book, it was written for me and people in my life stage.
So this is the Progress Principle. And as I said, we discovered the importance of making progress in meaningful work as the way that people stay motivated and engaged in their work and feeling good about themselves, their organizations, and their work. That discovery led me to wonder afterwards, so what happens when we end our meaningful work? When that time of our life is over? I think that this question in me, which began, 10, 11 years ago, arose in part because I was thinking about my own career end. I wasn't ready to retire at that point, not at all. But I was beginning to think about it, as many people do around age 60. So I pondered that and I thought, I'm going to look at the literature, see what's there about retirement. And, I'm a psychologist, or a social psychologist by training, a researcher. And what I found really wasn't much on the psychology of retiring. I found a lot on the importance of health and wealth for retirement decisions and retirement experiences. And certainly those are very important. And I had known that myself. It's hard to live in this culture without knowing the importance of saving for retirement. But I wanted to go beyond that. I wanted to find out what the experience of retiring was really like psychologically, and what happens with relationships in our lives when we retire, and what happens with our life structure, the way we live our days and our weeks and our months and our years. That's got to change drastically. How do people manage those challenges? So there wasn't much of anything on this. I decided to do a research project and ended up getting together with 4 fabulous colleagues who are all retired or retiring academics in the Boston area, as I was sort of at that same stage of life or beyond. Lotte Bailyn, who had retired from the MIT Sloan School of Management a few years earlier. I knew she was interested. I knew she was a fabulous star quality researcher. So she joined the team. A married couple, Marcy Crary of Bentley University, who's about my age, and Tim Hall, Douglas T. Hall, her husband at Boston University's Questrom School of Business. They were both interested in the topic. I had known Tim for a while, so they joined the team. And Tim's incredible colleague at Questrom, Kathy Kram, also became part of the team. All different perspectives, but it was magic when we came together. So we spent 10 years doing this research on the psychological and relational and life restructuring issues and challenges and opportunities that people face as they go through retirement.
That's great. I think I've, in my coaching, worked with a lot of senior leaders and those at the very top. And I know that there's this embracing of, shedding the burden of being on 24/7 and all that. But there's also the fear factor. What did you discover about fear, Teresa Amabile? So,
We were really surprised by the degree of dread that many people who are 55 plus, still working, seem to have about retirement. They used words like far away, scary, never, never. Right? They're 55 plus, and they're saying, "I'm never going to retire,"
yeah.
or that it's far away. Unknown was a big word that came up a lot. I think it's the uncertainty, John, that we have been settled in a life, those of us who are working professionals, a career that we care about, meaningful work where we have an impact. As leaders, we have an impact on our colleagues. We have an impact on our organizations. We many times have an impact on the world through our work and the work that our organization does. And to think about that ending, to think about giving up this rhythm and routine that has structured our lives for decades of knowing exactly what we were going to be doing, at least the broad outlines of it, every Monday through Friday, and often on much of the weekend time as well.
Right.
And then there's this one, as one of our interviewees put it, facing retirement is like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into a void.
Very well put and frightening. Now, I think there's another aspect to that. And talking to those who have retired at a senior level, I think what it is, it's a loss of relevance. When you're at the top of the heap, everybody answers your calls. People call you, want you. And once you walk out the door, as the ex-CEO, as the old joke goes, your golf game's not as good, your jokes aren't as funny, and your phone doesn't ring. So did you discover that fear of loss of relevance too? So.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we even found this, John, in some leaders in organizations who didn't realize that they had identified very much with their work, because we ask questions about work identity. Questions like, would you be more likely to say that your work is what you do or your work is who you are? And one person who was a middle-level manager, so she was in a leadership position. She'd been with the company for decades, very successful. She didn't feel she identified strongly with her work. She said, it's really what I do. It hasn't defined me. I love my work. I love my team. I respect and treasure this organization, but it doesn't define me. But for 4 years, she struggled with the decision. She would make the decision, okay, I'm going to retire this year. And then she'd pull back on the decision. 4 years, back and forth, back and forth. And she asked herself, as she told us in an interview, well, why don't you just retire? Because there were so many other things she wanted to do in her life. There were these things calling her. She said, one reason is that people do respect you while you're working. And after, maybe not so much. This identity of being a successful career woman, a successful leader in her company, was more important to her than she realized it was. So you're absolutely right. The question of relevance is a big piece of it. We saw ways that people managed this. This is a big challenge, but we saw many ways that people managed it well. I'm happy to talk about that if you'd like.
Absolutely. And I'll jump in here. About a year or so ago, I interviewed Steve Lopez about his book called Independence Day, about retirement, those who have tried it, those who succeeded, and those who had failed. And he said, and I always remember this phrase, he said, sometimes just in their retirement, we all need purpose, okay, or seek purpose. He said, maybe your purpose is just walking the dog that day. So how do you inject relevance or purpose into the retired life, Teresa? So
one important thing that we saw people doing is what we call identity bridging. And that is finding some piece of that pre-retirement identity that was very important to you and figuring out a way to bridge that identity or part of it into your retirement life. So one person we interviewed had been a very high level leader in his company, and he treasured that leader identity. He treasured that relevance and sense of purpose he had every day, affecting the lives of tens of thousands of people in his organization, not to mention the customers and the suppliers and the distributors. He had always, for decades, belonged to a church with his wife, and they were regular members. But he had never been terrifically engaged in the church because, as a C-suite executive, he just didn't have the time. But when he retired, he started becoming more engaged in that church. And within a year, he was leading the board of trustees of the church and taking on leadership of its capital campaign. So he felt extremely fulfilled in this role. Can you see how he bridged that leader identity?
I know that story. I have a friend who's done a very successful surgeon. When he retired, active in his church, took on the kind of responsibilities that you described. So you have a chapter in here which fascinated me. And when we think about retirement, should it be boom, I'm retiring on July 1st and I'm gone? Or should we sidestep it? Or what you talk about chapter of detaching from work? What does detaching from work mean? So
I'm going to preface this answer by saying there is no one best way to retire. It's very individuated. I kind of secretly hoped that we'd find a silver bullet for retiring when we were starting this research, that we'd find, okay, these are the 3 things that if you do them, you'll have a smooth transition into a satisfying retirement life. But no, we actually saw many different paths to that satisfying retirement life. The detaching from work can be very tricky, especially for high-level leaders in organizations. Because of that strong identification, there's that loss of professional identity that people fear. There's also the loss of professional relationships, where we may have worked with people for decades. They may have become close friends of ours, people with whom we shared a lot, people with whom we spent a lot of our time, a lot of our waking hours. And the relationships with subordinates are valued, if only because they give us this daily sense of respect, people looking to us for guidance. And then there's the fear of losing that life structure, that rhythm and routine of the way that work structures your life for so long in so many ways. We found that people could do this detachment often more easily if they did transition gradually into retirement. So we had, among the 120 people we interviewed, 14 of them allowed us to follow them throughout their retirement transition while they were still working in their last months or years of work, all the way through their early years of retirement. And among those stars, we did have a few who did a gradual transition, and it seemed really helpful to them. Two of these people had been at the top level of their organizations. And the two that I'm thinking of both worked full time until 6 months before they fully retired. And then they worked half time for those remaining 6 months, during which time they were able to begin to explore and experiment, which is one of the important tasks of retiring, of the retirement transition, trying to figure out what was meaningful to them in terms of spending their time that they weren't working now. That gradual transition was really important for both of them.
Right.
One of them got more engaged in nonprofits that he had been working with in some capacity beforehand. And the other one took up a passion from very early in his life, hot rodding. He had loved hot rodding as a teenager and a young adult, and then, family and career took over and he let it go. But as, in those 6 months, as he was approaching retirement, he thought, gosh, I loved being a hot rodder. That was an important identity, a dormant one that he reignited. That's another way of identity bridging, by the way. It was a leisure activity. It wasn't purpose or meaning with a big M. It was meaning with a small m, but it was incredibly fulfilling for him. He enjoyed tinkering with those cars. He enjoyed engaging with the hot rodding community. It brought him lots of new and satisfying relationships, as well as a great activity.
I love those stories. Now, did you perceive a difference in, say, coping or adjustment between men versus women? Or I have an idea who does it better, but what did your research tell you?
We thought we would find differences between men and women, but we didn't. We really did not find that either had an easier time retiring. The two stories of stars that stand out for me who had a great deal of difficulty were both men. But we had so few women. Of the 14, only 4 were women. They all had a reasonably smooth transition into a satisfying retirement life. I don't think we can draw conclusions from that. And among the retired people we interviewed, we honestly did not see gender differences.
Oh, that's great. It's good to know.
You want to tell me
So
what you suspected? What did you
I
suspect?
suspect that women were far better at coping, say, with the ego identity loss of that than would men would be. That would be my guess, because we're, the testosterone, what we have left of it, kind of kicks in. So that's what I was thinking. So, but I'm glad I'm wrong, or the
Yeah,
jury's
at
still out,
least
whatever.
according to our data, that's not the case. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So what about, tell me a quick, or if you can, what people who quote failed at retirement, what did they do about it, and what lessons can we learn from it? So,
I'm going to bring up the one particular case, and this is a person we talk about in the first chapter, John. I'm sure you remember the person we call Lawrence. He had been a very successful professional, and interestingly, he decided when he was 30 years old that he wanted himself and his wife to be able to retire around age 60. She completely agreed. And they managed their family finances all those years to be able to make that goal. And when he saw that target that coming into view when he was in his late 50s, work became much and much less important to him. It had been hugely important earlier in his life. We had people draw life maps to depict how they thought about the different elements of their life. And work had shrunk for him. Family was very big and travel with family was very big, but work had become pretty small by the time he was 60. He was still working when I started interviewing him. He had a pretty easy time with those first two tasks. Deciding to retire, he had his 30-year plan, bingo. He did it on the basis, only the basis of his financial status. That's important, I think, because he didn't think about other aspects of the retirement transition except the financial. He didn't think about the psychological, the relational, or the life restructuring issues. And detaching from work was a breeze for him. He said of his last day at work, he said, "I walked away and never looked back." So that was easy for him. But he struggled mightily with task 3 of the retirement transition, which is building a provisional retirement life. And that's a time when people, ideally, when it works well, they're exploring, they're experimenting with new activities, maybe new places to be, new groups, organizations, perhaps, new relationships. He didn't do that. And I'm going to start talking now in terms of the 4 A's, which are, we think, important guidelines for people in making a smooth transition. People need to think about alignment. That's the first A. Alignment between their self, that is, their most important identities, priorities, current needs, their most important values, as they are right now in their life. Not as they were at the peak of their career, maybe 20 years earlier, but as they are now. Alignment between that and their current life structure. If work is this big and everything else is this big, is that really aligned with who you are now, with the self that you are now? And what else is going on in your life structure? That's something that Lawrence wasn't aware of. And awareness is the second big A. You need to really have some insight into yourself and insight into your life structure and its dynamics and how it's affecting you. He didn't exercise agency, the third A. He didn't proactively make changes in his life that could improve things. So he and his wife, retired at the same time, moved 1,000 miles away to an unfamiliar city, Savannah, Georgia, where they knew only the 3 people they were related to there: their younger son, his wife, and the toddler grandson that Lawrence called the center of our world. Well, as you know from reading the book, things didn't work out so well. They had never had a deep conversation with that son and daughter-in-law about, okay, we're planning this move, we're thinking about it. Do you have expectations and hopes, and do you have concerns about us being down there? Tell us about your lives and how and whether we might fit in, and let us express our hopes and expectations and our concerns. They didn't really do that in advance. They didn't proactively, Lawrence didn't proactively try to manage the life structure aspects. And when they went down there, he didn't realize how his excessive drinking was affecting himself, his health, and his relationships. And unfortunately, when the son and daughter-in-law separated, very acrimonious separation during Lawrence's first year of retirement, the access to that little grandson that he had so treasured, he had been doing part-time daycare a few days a week, that was completely gone. That was restricted. So that was the only thing he had built into that life. He explored no groups or organizations, no new places to be, didn't even get to know his neighbors. So he spiraled down into alcoholism, pretty severe, and a state of unhappy inertia. And his wife was right there with him. They finally, when their sons threatened them, look, you go into treatment and stay sober or you're never seeing your grandchildren again. Thank God. That was the turning point. And they came out of long-term residential rehab sober. And as he put it, he did a complete 180 in his view of his life and himself. So at that point, he became proactive. He developed that agency. And he also developed adaptability to things like your son is divorcing. That's not something you can control. You have to adapt. That's the fourth A. He did it beautifully. I just heard from him a few weeks ago, still doing well, celebrating 50th anniversary, still sober, and very well connected into the community.
Well, that is a portentous story, but with one with a happy ending, and it's that caution. So I like that. So sadly, Teresa, we could keep going, but we are racing toward the end of our hour, and or half hour, excuse me, and that I ask every guest a story about grace, and I think the story that you said about Lawrence has elements of grace in it. But is there a story about grace that you would like to share with us? So.
There is, John, and I love that question of yours. I don't know exactly what this moment was. It was sometime in late November, early December of 1979, but it was the conception of my daughter, Christine. She has been a catalyst for good, certainly in my life. I have grown tremendously in the 44 years since that woman was born. We've been through a lot together, and she's a catalyst for good in the world now. And I love having her in my life. She is doing good things in the community around justice, around climate justice, around social equity. She is a wonderful professional doing great research in healthcare and helping with healthcare delivery. She's a wonderful mom. She's a wonderful mom. So I couldn't be more proud. And I would say that is grace with a capital G.
Well, what a wonderful story, and I always like it. Only a few folks that I've had have mentioned their children, and I like how you did it. And you spoke about how, well, you didn't say the word, but I'll use the word pride in her because of her service. She's living a life of grace, and I'll bet that comes from mom. So, too. So,
thank you, and her dad, and the other
yeah.
wonderful parental figures in her life.
Okay. Now I have to ask you, how can people find you and how can they find the book, Professor Amabile? So.
Retiringbook.com. That's the website for our book.
Okay.
It's one word, retiringbook.com. And there's information there about myself and all of my co-authors, more information about the book, a few videos with little findings from the book, and information on how to order the book.
Great. Well, we will put that in the notes, retiringbook.com. So wonderful, Teresa Amabile, Professor Teresa Amabile. I have followed you for decades, and it is such an honor to speak to you. And good luck. Would you hold up the book one more time, please? So,
I will.
Retiring, creating a life that works for you. An important topic. One more little last question. Who should buy this book? Is it just me, or should our children buy it for us? Should our companies buy it? What's your take?
Well, of course, it's for people who are anticipating retirement coming up or who are living in retirement. I think it can be very helpful in terms of the challenges that you might face and how you can meet those challenges well. But my daughter can tell you, she wishes that she had this book to help her own mom and dad with their retirement transitions. And honestly, many younger colleagues of mine have said it's been very useful for them in thinking about helping their parents. And very young people early in career do need to be thinking about these retirement issues. It's way more than saving with that 401k.
Great. Teresa Amabile, what a joy to have you. And with that, we will be out.